Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. 1984. 1984, often published as 1984, is a dystopian novel published in 1949 by English author George Orwell. The novel is set in Airstrip One, formerly Great Britain, a province of the superstate Oceania. Oceania is a world of perpetual war, omnipresent government surveillance and public manipulation. Oceania's residents are dictated by a political regime euphemistically named English Socialism, shortened to Ingsoc in Newspeak. Newspeak is the government's invented language. The superstate is under the control of the privileged elite inner party. The inner party, persecutes individualism and independent thinking known as thoughtcrimes and is enforced by the thought police. The tyranny is ostensibly overseen by Big Brother, the party leader who enjoys an intense cult of personality but who may not even exist. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. It is not interested in the good of others. It is interested solely in power. The protagonist of the novel, Winston Smith, is a member of the outer party who works for the Ministry of Truth, a mini-true in Newspeak. The mini-true is responsible for propaganda and historical revisionism. His job is to rewrite past newspaper articles so that the historical record always supports the party line. The workers are told they're correcting misquotations when in actuality, they are writing false information as truth. The ministry also destroys all documents that have not been edited. In this way, there is no proof that the government is lying. Smith is a diligent and skillful worker, but he secretly hates the party and dreams of rebellion against Big Brother. The heroine of the novel, Julia, is based on Orwell's second wife, Sonia Orwell. As literary political fiction and dystopian science fiction, 1984 is a classic novel in content, plot and style. Many of its terms and concepts, such as Big Brother, doublethink, thoughtcrime, Newspeak, Room 101, Telescreen 225 and Memory Hole, have entered into common use since its publication in 1949. 1984 popularized the adjective Orwellian, which describes official deception, secret surveillance, brazenly misleading terminology and manipulation of recorded history by a totalitarian or authoritarian state. In 2005, the novel was chosen by Time magazine as one of the 100 best English-language novels from 1923 to 2005. It was awarded a place on both lists of Modern Library 100 Best Novels, reaching number 13 on the editor's list and 6 on the reader's list. In 2003, the novel was listed at number 8 on the BBC's survey The Big Read. History and title. Orwell encapsulates the thesis at the heart of his unforgiving novel in 1944. The implications of dividing the world up into zones of influence, which had been conjured by the Tehran Conference. 3 years later, he wrote most of it on the Scottish island of Jura. From 1947 to 1948, despite being seriously ill with tuberculosis, on the 4th of December 1948, he sent the final manuscript to the publisher Secker and Warburg, and 1984 was published on 8 June 1949. By 1989, it had been translated into 65 languages, more than any other novel in English until then. The title of the novel, its themes, the Newspeak language, and the author's surname are often invoked against control and intrusion by the state. And the adjective Orwellian describes a totalitarian dystopia that is characterized by government control and subjugation of the people. Orwell's invented language, Newspeak, satirizes hypocrisy and evasion by the state. The Ministry of Love oversees torture and brainwashing. The Ministry of Plenty oversees shortage and rationing. The Ministry of Peace oversees war and atrocity, and the Ministry of Truth oversees propaganda. and historical revisionism. The Last Man in Europe was an early title for the novel, but in a letter dated the 22nd of October 1948 to his publisher Frederick Warburg, 8 months before publication, Orwell wrote about hesitating between that title and 1984. Warburg suggested choosing the main title to be the latter, a more commercial one. In the novel 1985, Anthony Burgess suggests that Orwell, disillusioned by the onset of the Cold War, intended to call the book 1948. The introduction to the Penguin Books Modern Classics edition of 1984 reports that Orwell originally set the novel in 1980, but that he later shifted the date to 1982 and then to 1984. The introduction to the Houghton Mifflin Harcourt edition of Animal Farm and 1984 reports that the title 1984 was chosen simply as an inversion of the year 1948, the year in which it was being completed, and that the date was meant to give an immediacy and urgency to the menace of totalitarian rule. Throughout its publication history, 1984 has been either banned or legally challenged as subversive or ideologically corrupting, like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, Calicane by Karen Boy, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Some writers consider the Russian dystopian novel We by Zamyatin to have influenced 1984, and the novel bears significant similarities in its plot and characters to Darkness at Noon, written years before by Arthur Koestler, who was a personal friend of Orwell. Copyright status. The novel is in the public domain in Canada, South Africa, Argentina, Australia and Oman. It will be in the public domain in the United Kingdom and Brazil in 2021, and in the United States in 2044. Background. 1984 is set in Oceania, one of 3 intercontinental superstates that divided the world after a global war. Smith's memories and his reading of the prescribed book The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein reveal that after the Second World War, the United Kingdom became involved in a war fought in Europe, Western Russia and North America. During the early 1950s, nuclear weapons were used during the war, leading to the destruction of Colchester. London would also suffer widespread aerial raids, leading Winston's family to take refuge in a London Underground station. Britain felt a civil war, with street fighting in London before the English Socialist Party, abbreviated as Ingsoc, emerged victorious and formed a totalitarian government in Britain. The British Commonwealth was absorbed by the United States to become Oceania. Eventually, the English Socialist Party, abbreviated as Ingsoc, emerged to form a totalitarian government in the country. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union conquered continental Europe and established the second superstate of Eurasia. The third superstate of Eastasia would emerge in the Far East after several decades of fighting. The 3 superstates waged perpetual war for the remaining unconquered lands of the world in a rough quadrilateral with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin and Hong Kong, through constantly shifting alliances. Although each of the 3 states are said to have sufficient natural resources, the war continues in order to maintain ideological control over the people. However, due to the fact that Winston barely remembers these events and due to the party's manipulation of history, the continuity and accuracy of these events are unclear. Winston himself notes that the party has claimed credit for inventing helicopters, airplanes, and trains, while Julia theorizes that the perpetual bombing of London is merely a false flag operation designed to convince the populace that a war is occurring. If the official account was accurate, Smith's strengthening memories and the story of his family's dissolution suggest that the atomic bombings occurred first, followed by civil war featuring confused street fighting in London itself, and the societal post-war reorganisation which the party retrospectively calls the Revolution. Most of the plot takes place in London, the chief city of Airstrip One, the oceanic province that had once been called England or Britain. Posters of the party leader Big Brother, bearing the caption "Big Brother is watching you," dominate the city, while the ubiquitous telescreen monitors the private and public lives of the populace. Military parades, propaganda films and public executions are said to be commonplace. The class hierarchy of Oceania has three levels, as the government. The party controls the population with four ministries. The protagonist, Winston Smith, a member of the outer party, works in the records department of the Ministry of Truth as an editor, revising historical records to make the past conform to the ever-changing party line, and deleting references to unpersons, people who have been vaporized, i.e. not only killed by the state but denied existence even in history or memory. The story of Winston Smith begins on the 4th of April 1984. It was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Yet he is uncertain of the true date, given the regime's continual rewriting and manipulation of history. Plot: Winston Smith is a man who lives in Airstrip One, the remnants of Britain broken down by war, civil conflict and revolution in the year 1984. A member of the middle-class outer party, Winston lives in a one-room London flat in the Victory Mansions. Smith lives on rations consisting of black bread, synthetic meals and Victory-branded gin. Telescreens in every building accompanied by microphones and cameras allow the thought police to identify anyone who might compromise the party's regime, and threat of surveillance forces citizens to display an obligatory optimism regarding the country, who are afraid for being arrested for thought crime, the infraction of expressing thoughts contradictory to the party's ideology. Children are encouraged to inform the officials about potential thought criminals, including their parents, and are indoctrinated by party propaganda from an early age. Winston's neighbor, Mr. Parsons, is deeply involved in patriotic activism, and his children are highly indoctrinated with party propaganda and desensitized to violence. Winston works at the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True, as an editor. He is responsible for historical negationism. He rewrites records and alters photographs to conform to the state's ever-changing version of history itself, rendering the deleted people unpersons. The original documents are destroyed by fire in a memory hole. At work, he rewrites a Times article reporting on a government official condemned as a thought criminal by writing a story on a non-existent war hero named Comrade Ogilvy, and notes the state-sponsored media reporting an increase in the chocolate ration during an actual decrease. Despite his proficiency in his profession, Winston becomes mesmerized by the true past after seeing a photograph of three former high-ranking upper-class inner party officials in New York discounting the official government account that they had been collaborating with Eurasian officials. Winston tries to get more information about the true past, and purchases an old journal in an antiques shop in a proletarian neighborhood of London, in a place beside his flat's telescreen where he believes he cannot be seen. He begins writing a journal criticizing the party and its enigmatic leader Big Brother. By doing so he commits a crime that, if discovered by the thought police, warrants certain death, and Winston quickly resigns himself to the fact that he will eventually be arrested for thought crime. In the journal he records his sexual frustration over a young woman maintaining the novel writing machines at the ministry named Julia, whom Winston is attracted to but suspects is an informant. He also suspects that his superior, an inner party official named O'Brien, is a secret agent. for an enigmatic underground resistance movement known as the Brotherhood, a group formed by Big Brother's reviled political rival Emmanuel Goldstein. The next day, Julia surreptitiously hands Winston a note confessing her love for him. Winston and Julia begin an affair after Winston realizes she shares his loathing of the party. First meeting in the country and eventually in a rented room at the top of the antiques shop, where Winston purchased the diary, which is owned by the seemingly kindly Mr. Charrington. They believe that the shop is safe as the room has no telescreen. During his affair with Julia, Winston remembers the death of his family during the Civil War of the 1950s. Winston stole rationed chocolate from his malnourished infant sister and his mother, and would return home to discover that they had disappeared. He also recounts his terse relationship with his ex-wife Catherine, whom he was forced to have sex with and despised to such an extent that he considered pushing her off a cliff. During a nature walk, Winston also interacts with his colleague Syme, who is writing a dictionary for a revised version of the English language called Newspeak. After Syme insightfully reveals that the true purpose of Newspeak is to reduce the capacity of human thought, Winston speculates that he will be vaporized. He is later proven correct when Syme disappears without a trace, and no one acknowledges his absence. Weeks later, Winston is approached by O'Brien. They arrange a meeting at O'Brien's flat where both Winston and Julia swear allegiance to the Brotherhood. A week later, O'Brien clandestinely sends Winston a copy of the book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein, the publicly reviled leader of the Brotherhood. Through the book, the author explains the structure and practices of Oceania. In particular, the book explains the concept of perpetual war, the true meanings of the slogans "war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength," and how the party can be overthrown through means of the political awareness of the proles. The thought police capture Winston along with Julia in the rented room. The two are then delivered to the Ministry of Love for interrogation. Mr. Charrington, the shopkeeper who rented the room to them, reveals himself as a thought police agent. O'Brien is also an agent of the thought police. He is part of a special sting operation used by the police to find and arrest suspected thought criminals. Winston is placed in a prison cell with Parsons, who had been reported by his children and believes himself to be guilty. O'Brien interrogates and tortures Winston with electroshock, telling Winston that he can cure himself of his insanity, his manifest hatred for the party, through controlled manipulation of perception. Winston is held in the prison for an unspecified length of time and confesses to crimes that O'Brien tells him to say that he has committed, but O'Brien understands that Winston has not betrayed Julia. After awakening from a nightmare in which he confesses his love for Julia, O'Brien sends him to room 101 for the final stage of re-education, a room which contains each prisoner's worst fear. Winston shouts "Do it" to Julia, as a wire cage holding hungry rats is fitted onto his face, thus betraying her. After being put back into society, Winston meets Julia in a park. She admits that she was also tortured, and both reveal betraying the other. Later, Winston sits alone in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, as he remembers a rare happy memory of his family. He convinces himself that it is false. A raucous celebration begins outside, celebrating Oceania's decisive victory over Eurasian armies in Africa, and Winston imagines himself as a part of the crowd. As Winston imagines a gun being pointed at his head, he feels that he has at last ended his stubborn, self-willed exile from the love of Big Brother, a love Winston returns quite happily as he looks up in admiration at a portrait of Big Brother. Ingsoc. Ingsoc is the predominant ideology and pseudo-philosophy of Oceania, and Newspeak is the official language of official documents. Ministries of Oceania. In London, the capital city of Airstrip One, Oceania's 4 government ministries are in pyramids, the facades of which display the party's 3 slogans. The ministries' names are the opposite of their true functions. The Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. Ministry of Peace. The Ministry of Peace supports Oceania's perpetual war against either of the 2 other superstates. The primary aim of modern warfare is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so even if no artificial processes of destruction had been at work. Ministry of Plenty. The Ministry of Plenty rations and controls food, goods and domestic production. Every fiscal quarter it publishes false claims of having raised the standard of living when it has, in fact, reduced rations availability and production. The Ministry of Truth substantiates Ministry of Plenty's claims by revising historical records to report numbers supporting the current increased rations. Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Truth controls information, news, entertainment, education and the arts. Winston Smith works in the Ministry rectifying historical records to concord with Big Brother's current pronouncements so that everything the party says is true. Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Love identifies, monitors arrests and converts real and imagined dissidents. In Winston's experience, the dissident is beaten and tortured, and when near broken he is sent to room 101 to face the worst thing in the world until love for Big Brother and the party replaces dissension. Political geography. 3 perpetually warring totalitarian superstates control the world. The perpetual war is fought for control of the disputed area lying between the frontiers of the superstates, which forms a rough parallelogram with its corners at Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin and Hong Kong. And Northern Africa, the Middle East, India and Indonesia are where the superstates capture and use slave labor. Fighting also takes place between Eurasia and East Asia, in Manchuria, Mongolia, and Central Asia, and all 3 powers battle one another over various Atlantic and Pacific islands. Goldstein's book The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism explains that the superstates' ideologies are alike, and that the public's ignorance of this fact is imperative so that they might continue believing in the detestability of the opposing ideologies. The only references to the exterior world for the Oceanian citizen are a Ministry of Truth maps and propaganda to ensure the belief in the war. The Revolution. Winston Smith's memory, and Emmanuel Goldstein's book communicate some of the history that precipitated the revolution. Eurasia was formed when the Soviet Union conquered continental Europe, creating a single state stretching from Portugal to the Bering Strait. Eurasia does not include the British Isles because the United States annexed them along with the rest of the British Empire and Latin America, thus establishing Oceania and gaining control over a quarter of the planet. Eastasia, the last superstate established, emerged only after a decade of confused fighting. It includes the Asian lands conquered by China and Japan. Although Eastasia is prevented from matching Eurasia's size, its larger populace compensates for that handicap. The annexation of Britain occurred about the same time as the atomic war that provoked civil war. But who fought whom in the war is left unclear. Nuclear weapons fell on Britain. An atomic bombing of Colchester is referenced in the text. Exactly how Ingsoc and its rival systems gained power in the respective countries is also unclear. While the precise chronology cannot be traced, most of the global societal reorganization occurred between 1945 and the early 1960s. Winston and Julia once meet in the ruins of a church that was destroyed in a nuclear attack 30 years earlier, which suggests 1954 as the year of the atomic war that destabilized society and allowed the party to seize power. It is stated in the novel that the fourth quarter of 1983 was also the sixth quarter of the ninth three-year plan, which implies that the first quarter of the first three-year plan began in July 1958. By then, the party was apparently in control of Oceania. The war. In 1984 there is a perpetual war between Oceania, Eurasia and Eastasia, the superstates that emerged from the global atomic war. The theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein explains that each state is so strong it cannot be defeated even with the combined forces of two superstates despite changing alliances. To hide such contradictions, history is rewritten to explain that the alliance always was so. The populaces are accustomed to doublethink and accept it. The war is not fought in Oceanian, Eurasian or East Asian territory, but in the Arctic wastes and in a disputed zone comprising the sea and land from Tangiers to Darwin. At the start, Oceania and Eastasia are allies fighting Eurasia in northern Africa and the Malabar coast. That alliance ends and Oceania, allied with Eurasia, fights Eastasia. A change occurring on Hate Week dedicated to creating patriotic fervor for the party's perpetual war. The public are blind to the change. In mid-sentence, an orator changes the name of the enemy from Eurasia to Eastasia without pause. When the public are enraged at noticing that the wrong flags and posters are displayed, they tear them down. The party later claims to have captured Africa. Goldstein's book explains that the purpose of the unwinnable perpetual war is to consume human labor and commodities so that the economy of a superstate cannot support economic equality with a high standard of life for every citizen. By using up most of the produced objects like boots and rations, the proles are kept poor and uneducated and will neither realize what the government is doing nor rebel. Goldstein also details an Oceanian strategy of attacking enemy cities with atomic rockets before invasion, but dismisses it as unfeasible and contrary to the war's purpose. Despite the atomic bombing of cities in the 1950s, the superstates stopped it for fear that would imbalance the powers. The military technology in the novel differs little from that of World War II, but strategic bomber aeroplanes are replaced with rocket bombs. Helicopters were heavily used as weapons of war, and surface combat units have been all but replaced by immense and unsinkable floating fortresses, island-like contraptions concentrating the firepower of the whole naval task force in a single, semi-mobile platform. Living standards. The society of Airstrip One, and according to the book almost the whole world, lives in poverty. Hunger, disease and filth are the norms. Ruined cities and towns are common, the consequence of the Civil War, the atomic wars, and the purportedly enemy rockets. Social decay and wrecked buildings surround Winston. Were aside from the ministerial pyramids, little of London was rebuilt. Members of the outer party consume synthetic foodstuffs and poor-quality luxuries, such as oily gin and loosely packed cigarettes distributed under the Victory brand. Winston describes something as simple as the repair of a broken pane of glass as requiring committee approval that can take several years, and so most of those living in one of the blocks usually do the repairs themselves. All outer-party residences include telescreens that serve both as outlets for propaganda and to monitor the party members. They can be turned down, but they cannot be turned off. In contrast to their subordinates, the inner-party upper class of Oceanian society reside in clean and comfortable flats in their own quarter of the city, with pantries well stocked with foodstuffs such as wine, coffee and sugar, all denied to the general populace. Winston is astonished that the lifts in O'Brien's building work, the telescreens can be switched off, and O'Brien has an Asian manservant, Martin. All members of the inner party are attended to by slaves captured in the disputed zone, and the book suggests that many have their own motorcars or even helicopters. Nonetheless, the book makes clear that even the conditions enjoyed by the inner party are only relatively comfortable, and standards would be regarded as austere by those of the pre-revolutionary elite. The proles live in poverty and are kept sedated with alcohol, pornography and a national lottery whose winnings are never actually paid out. That is obscured by propaganda and the lack of communication within Oceania. At the same time, the proles are freer and less intimidated than the middle-class outer party. They are subject to certain levels of monitoring but are not expected to be particularly patriotic. They lack telescreens in their own homes and often jeer at the telescreens that they see. The book indicates that is because the middle class, not the lower class, traditionally starts revolutions. The model demands tight control of the middle class, with ambitious outer party members neutralized via promotion to the inner party or reintegration by the Ministry of Love, and proles can be allowed intellectual freedom because they lack intellect. Winston nonetheless believes that the future belonged to the proles. The standard of living of the populace is low overall. Consumer goods are scarce, and all those available through official channels are of low quality. For instance, despite the party regularly reporting increased boot production, more than half of the Oceanian populace goes barefoot. The party claims that poverty is a necessary sacrifice for the war effort, and the book confirms that to be partially correct, since the purpose of perpetual war consumes surplus industrial production. Outer party members and proles occasionally gain access to better items in the market, which deals in goods that were pilfered from the residences of the inner party. Nationalism. 1984 expands upon the subjects summarized in Orwell's essay Notes on Nationalism, about the lack of vocabulary needed to explain the unrecognized phenomena behind certain political forces. In 1984, the party's artificial minimalist language, Newspeak, addresses the matter. O'Brien concludes, "The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power." Censorship. A major theme of 1984 is censorship, especially in the Ministry of Truth, where photographs are modified and public archives rewritten to rid them of unpersons. On the telescreens, figures for all types of production are grossly exaggerated or simply invented to indicate an ever-growing economy when the reality is the opposite. One small example of the endless censorship is Winston being charged with the task of eliminating a reference to an unperson in a newspaper article. He proceeds to write an article about Comrade Ogilvy, a made-up party member who displayed great heroism by leaping into the sea from a helicopter so that the dispatches he was carrying would not fall into enemy hands. Surveillance. The inhabitants of Oceania, particularly the outer party members, have no real privacy. Many of them live in apartments equipped with two-way telescreens so that they may be watched or listened to at any time. Similar telescreens are found at workstations and in public places. along with hidden microphones. Written correspondence is routinely opened and read by the government before it is delivered. The thought police employ undercover agents who pose as normal citizens and report any person with subversive tendencies. Children are encouraged to report suspicious persons to the government, and some denounce their parents. Citizens are controlled in the smallest sign of rebellion. Even something so small as a facial expression can result in immediate arrest and imprisonment. Thus citizens, particularly party members, are compelled to obedience. Newspeak Appendix. The Principles of Newspeak is an academic essay appended to the novel. It describes the development of Newspeak, the party's minimalist artificial language meant to ideologically align thought and action with the principles of Ingsoc by making all other modes of thought impossible. Whether or not the Newspeak appendix implies a hopeful end to 1984 remains a critical debate, as it is in standard English and refers to Newspeak, Ingsoc, the party, etc. in the past tense, relative to our own. The Newspeak vocabulary was tiny and new ways of reducing it were constantly being devised. Page 422. Some critics claim that for the essay's author both Newspeak and the totalitarian government are in the past. Sources for literary motifs. 1984 uses themes from life in the Soviet Union and wartime life in Great Britain as sources for many of its motifs. American producer Sidney Sheldon wrote to Orwell in the early 1950s. Interested in adapting the novel to the Broadway stage, Orwell sold the American stage rights to Sheldon, explaining that his basic goal with 1984 was imagining the consequences of Stalinist government ruling British society. 1984 was based chiefly on communism, because that is the dominant form of totalitarianism, but I was trying chiefly to imagine what communism would be like if it were firmly rooted in the English-speaking countries, and was no longer a mere extension of the Russian Foreign Office. The statement 225 used to torment Winston Smith during his interrogation was a Communist Party slogan from the Second Five-Year Plan, which encouraged fulfillment of the five-year plan in 4 years. The slogan was seen in electric lights on Moscow house fronts, billboards and elsewhere. The switch of Oceania's allegiance from Eastasia to Eurasia, and the subsequent rewriting of history is evocative of the Soviet Union's changing relations with Nazi Germany. The two nations were open and frequently vehement critics of each other until the signing of the 1939 Treaty of Non-Aggression. Thereafter, and continuing until the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, no criticism of Germany was allowed in the Soviet press, and all references to prior party lines stopped, including in the majority of non-Russian communist parties who tended to follow the Russian line. Orwell had criticized the Communist Party of Great Britain for supporting the treaty in his essays for betrayal of the left. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 reversed the Soviet Union's stated foreign policy. It was too much for many of the fellow travelers like Gollancz, Orwell's sometime publisher, who had put their faith in a strategy of construction Popular Front governments and the peace bloc between Russia, Britain and France. The description of Emmanuel Goldstein with a small goatee beard evokes the image of Leon Trotsky. The film of Goldstein, during the 2 minutes hate, is described as showing him being transformed into a bleating sheep. This image was used in a propaganda film during the Kino I period of Soviet film, which showed Trotsky transforming into a goat. Goldstein's book is similar to Trotsky's highly critical analysis of the USSR, The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936. The omnipresent images of Big Brother, a man described as having a moustache, bears resemblance to the cult of personality built up around Joseph Stalin. The news in Oceania emphasized production figures just as it did in the Soviet Union, where record-setting in factories was especially glorified. The best known of these was Alexei Stakhanov, who purportedly set a record for coal mining in 1935. The tortures of the Ministry of Love evoke the procedures used by the NKVD in their interrogations, including the use of rubber truncheons being forbidden, to put your hands in your pockets, remaining in brightly lit rooms for days, torture through the use of provoked rodents, and the victim being shown a mirror after their physical collapse. The random bombing of Airstrip One is based on the buzz bombs and the V-2 rocket, which struck England at random in 1944-1945. The Thought Police is based on the NKVD, which arrested people for random anti-Soviet remarks. The thought crime motif is drawn from Kempeitai, the Japanese wartime secret police who arrested people for unpatriotic thoughts. The confessions of the thought criminals Rutherford Aronson and Jones are based on the show trials of the 1930s, which included fabricated confessions by prominent Bolsheviks Nikolai Bukharin, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, to the effect that they were being paid by the Nazi government to undermine the Soviet regime under Leon Trotsky's direction. The song, "Under the Spreading Chestnut Tree," was based on an Old English song called "Go No More A-Rushing." The song was published as early as 1891. The song was a popular camp song in the 1920s, sung with corresponding movements. Glenn Miller recorded the song in 1939. The Hates were inspired by the constant rallies sponsored by party organs throughout the Stalinist period. These were often short pep talks given to workers before their shifts began, but could also last for days, as in the annual celebrations of the anniversary of the October Revolution. Orwell fictionalized Newspeak, doublethink and Ministry of Truth as evinced by both the Soviet press and that of Nazi Germany. In particular, he adapted Soviet ideological discourse constructed to ensure that public statements could not be questioned. Winston Smith's job revising history are based on the Stalinist habit of airbrushing images of fallen people from group photographs and removing references to them in books and newspapers. In one well-known example, the Soviet encyclopedia had an article about Lavrent Beria when he fell in 1953 and was subsequently executed. Institutes that had the encyclopedia were sent an article about the Bering Strait with instructions to paste it over the article about Beria. Big Brother's orders of the day were inspired by Stalin's regular wartime orders called by the same name. A small collection of the more political of these have been published in English as On the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union by Joseph Stalin. Like Big Brother's orders of the day, Stalin's frequently lauded heroic individuals like Comrade Ogilvy, the fictitious hero Winston Smith invented to rectify a Big Brother order of the day. The Ingsoc slogan "Our New Happy Life" repeated from telescreens evokes Stalin's 1935 statement, which became a CPSU slogan: "Life has become better. Comrades, life has become more cheerful." In 1940, Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges published Ton Utbar, Orbis Tertius, which described the invention by a benevolent secret society of a world that would seek to remake human language and reality along human-invented lines. The story concludes with an appendix describing the success of the project. Borges' story addresses similar themes of epistemology, language and history to 1984. Influences. During World War II, Orwell believed that British democracy as it existed before 1939 would not survive the war. The question being, would it end via fascist coup d'etat from above or via socialist revolution? from below. Later he admitted that events proved him wrong. What really matters is that I fell into the trap of assuming that the war and the revolution are inseparable. 1984, and Animal Farm share themes of the betrayed revolution, the person's subordination to the collective, rigorously enforced class distinctions, the cult of personality, concentration camps, thought police, compulsory regimented daily exercise, and youth leagues. Oceania resulted from the U.S. annexation of the British Empire to counter the Asian peril to Australia and New Zealand. It is a naval power whose militarism venerates the sailors of the floating fortresses, from which battle is given to recapturing India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Much of oceanic society is based upon the USSR under Joseph Stalin, Big Brother. The televised 2 minutes hate is ritual demonization of the enemies of the state, especially Emmanuel Goldstein. Altered photographs and newspaper articles create unpersons deleted from the national historical record, including even founding members of the regime in the 1960s purges. A similar thing also happened during the French Revolution, in which many of the original leaders of the revolution were later put to death. For example, Danton, who was put to death by Robespierre, and then later Robespierre himself met the same fate. In his 1946 essay Why I Write, Orwell explains that the serious works he wrote since the Spanish Civil War were written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. 1984 is a cautionary tale about revolution betrayed by totalitarian defenders, previously proposed in homage to Catalonia and Animal Farm, while Coming Up for Air celebrates the personal and political freedoms lost in 1984. Biographer Michael Sheldon notes Orwell's Edwardian childhood at Henley-on-Thames as the Golden Country, being bullied at St Cyprian's School as his empathy with victims, his life in the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, and the techniques of violence and censorship in the BBC as capricious authority. Other influences include Darkness at Noon, and The Yogi and the Commissar by Arthur Koestler. The Iron Heel by Jack London. 1920, Dips into the Near Future by John A. Hobson. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. We, by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which he reviewed in 1946, and The Managerial Revolution by James Burnham, predicting perpetual war among 3 totalitarian superstates. Orwell told Jacintha Buddicom that he would write a novel stylistically like a modern utopia by H. G. Wells. Extrapolating from World War II, the novel's pastiche parallels the politics and rhetoric at war's end, the changed alliances at the Cold War's beginning. The Ministry of Truth derives from the BBC's overseas service controlled by the Ministry of Information. Room 101 derives from a conference room at BBC Broadcasting House, the Senate House of the University of London, containing the Ministry of Information, is the architectural inspiration for the Mini-True. The post-war decrepitude derives from the socio-political life of the UK and the US, i.e. the impoverished Britain of 1948 losing its empire despite newspaper-reported imperial triumph and war ally but peacetime foe Soviet Russia became Eurasia. The term English Socialism has precedence in his wartime writings, in the essay The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. He said that the war and the revolution are inseparable. The fact that we are at war has turned socialism from a textbook word into a realizable policy, because Britain's superannuated social class system hindered the war effort, and only a socialist economy would defeat Adolf Hitler. Given the middle class grasping this, they too would abide socialist revolution, and that only reactionary Britons would oppose it, thus limiting the force revolutionaries would need to take power. An English socialism would come about which will never lose touch with a tradition of compromise and the belief in a law that is above the state. It will shoot traitors, but it will give them a solemn trial beforehand, and occasionally it will acquit them. It will crush any open revolt promptly and cruelly, but it will interfere very little with the spoken and written word. In the world of 1984, English socialism is a totalitarian ideology unlike the English Revolution he foresaw. Comparison of the wartime essay The Lion and the Unicorn with 1984 shows that he perceived a Big Brother regime as a perversion of his cherished socialist ideals and English socialism. Thus Oceania is a corruption of the British Empire he believed would evolve into a federation of socialist states like a looser and freer version of the Union of Soviet Republics. Critical reception. When first published, 1984 was generally well received by reviewers. V.S. Pritchett, reviewing the novel for The New Statesman, stated, "I do not think I have ever read a novel more frightening and depressing, and yet such are the originality, the suspense, the speed of writing, and withering indignation that it is impossible to put the book down." P.H. Newby, reviewing 1984 for the Listener magazine, described it as the most arresting political novel written by an Englishman since Rex Warner's The Aerodrome. 1984 was also praised by Bertrand Russell, E.M. Forster and Harold Nicholson. On the other hand, Edward Shanks, reviewing 1984 for the Sunday Times, was dismissive. Shanks claimed 1984 breaks all records for gloomy vaticination. C.S. Lewis was also critical of the novel, claiming that the relationship of Julia and Winston, and especially the party's view on sex, lacked credibility and that the setting was odious rather than tragic. In other media, 1984 has been adapted for the cinema, radio, television and theatre at least twice each, as well as for other art media such as ballet and opera. Cultural impact. The effect of 1984 on the English language is extensive. The concepts of Big Brother, Room 101, the thought police, thought crime and person memory hole, doublethink and newspeak have become common phrases for denoting totalitarian authority. Doublespeak and groupthink are both deliberate elaborations of doublethink, and the adjective Orwellian means similar to Orwell's writings, especially 1984. The practice of ending words with is drawn from the novel. Orwell is perpetually associated with 1984. In July 1984, an asteroid was discovered by Antonin Markos and named after Orwell. References to the themes, concepts, and plot of 1984 have appeared frequently in other works, especially in popular music and video entertainment. An example is the worldwide hit reality television show Big Brother, in which a group of people live together in a large house isolated from the outside world, but continuously watched by television cameras. The book touches on the invasion of privacy and ubiquitous surveillance. From mid-2013 it was publicized that the NSA has been secretly monitoring and storing global internet traffic, including the bulk data collection of email and phone call data. Sales of 1984 increased by up to 7 times within the first week of the 2013 mass surveillance leaks. The book again topped the Amazon.com sales charts in 2017 after a controversy involving Kellyanne Conway using the phrase alternative facts to explain discrepancies with the media. The book also shows mass media as a catalyst for the intensification of destructive emotions and violence. Since the 20th century, news and other forms of media have been publicizing violence more often. In 2013, the Almeida Theatre and Headlong staged a successful new adaptation which twice toured the UK and played an extended run in London's West End. The play opened on Broadway in 2017. Brave New World comparisons. In the decades since the publication of 1984, there have been numerous comparisons to the Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World, which had been published 17 years earlier in 1932. They are both predictions of societies dominated by a central government, and are both based on extensions of the trends of their times. However, members of the ruling class of 1984 used brutal force, torture and mind control to keep individuals in line, but rulers in Brave New World keep the citizens in line by addictive drugs and pleasurable distractions. In October 1949, after reading 1984, Huxley sent a letter to Orwell and wrote that it would be more efficient for rulers to stay in power by the softer touch, by allowing citizens to self-seek pleasure to control them rather than brute force, and to allow a false sense of freedom. Elements of both novels can be seen in modern-day societies, with Huxley's vision being more dominant in the West and Orwell's vision more prevalent, with dictators in ex-communist countries and the theocracies and the dictatorships of the Middle East, as is pointed out in essays that compare the two novels, including Huxley's own Brave New World Revisited. However, that assessment was reconsidered in 2017, with the presidency of Donald Trump and the associated burst in popularity of Orwell's novel. Comparisons with other dystopian novels like The Handmaid's Tale, Virtual Light, The Private Eye, and Children of Men have also been drawn. Sources: Afterword by Eric Fromm, pp. 324-37. Orwell's text has a selected bibliography, pp. 338-39. The foreword and the afterword each contain further references. The Plume edition is an authorized reprint of a hardcover edition published by Harcourt Inc. The Plume edition is also published in a Signet edition. The copyright page says this, but the Signet ed. does not have the Pynchon forward. Copyright is explicitly extended to digital and any other means. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?